Mondays are always a struggle, but this one's going to be a real uphill battle. Global financial markets are tanking again in the wake of US President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs. Stock exchanges across Asia plunged at the start of the new week of trading, with fears growing of a global recession. Shares in Hong Kong are down more than 12%. It's the worst day in well over a decade. We've also seen slides in Taiwan, Japan, China, India and South Korea. As investors retreat, huge amounts of money have been wiped off companies' balance sheets worldwide. Despite the chaos on the markets, the US president has defended the steep tariffs he announced last week.
I don't want anything to go down, but sometimes you have to take medicine to fix something. And we have such a horrible, we have been treated so badly by other countries because we had stupid leadership that allowed this to happen. They took our businesses, they took our money, they took our jobs.
They're calling it Ugly Monday. Let's take a look at the markets here in Europe, which are now just starting to open. This is the live scene at the Frankfurt Stock Exchange in Germany. After a terrible start to trading, all eyes are now on the performance today of European exchanges. Well, imports from EU countries to the US will face new tariffs of 20% starting Wednesday. EU trade ministers are gathering in Luxembourg to discuss how the bloc could and should respond. Some member states favour hitting back with retaliatory levies on American goods, but others want to dial down the tensions to avert an all-out trade war.
Every day, €4.5 billion worth of goods and services cross the Atlantic between the European Union and the United States. This bilateral trade is the largest in the world. The tariffs imposed by the Trump administration now make doing business in the US more costly for Europe, and Brussels is preparing to respond strongly. But the preferred option in the EU is a negotiated solution with Washington. Germany's finance minister even calling for removing all tariffs on all imports.
The easiest way to assure balance and fairness is if everyone goes to zero, and then we have free trade and efficiency, economies of scale. The key is to send a signal that we are willing up to including reducing tariffs all the way to zero.
This would be welcomed by the world's richest man.
At the end of the day, I hope it is agreed that both Europe and the United States should move, ideally, in my view, to a zero tariff situation, effectively creating a free trade zone.
Free trade between the European Union and the United States remains an aspiration, and experts I've spoken to here agree that cancelling the tariffs on the goods and services currently traded between the US and the EU would be good for both sides.
Dropping tariffs bilaterally between the US and the EU most definitely would be the best outcome. Having cheaper trade between those two economies would benefit both of them. Whereas the flip side, if we have tariffs 20% on each side, that increase costs for both sides. Tariffs are a tax. Tariffs are an import tax, and that can be lowered very quickly, very easily.
Liberation Day.
On the day he announced the US's new measures, Donald Trump suggested he could be open to zero tariffs.
To all of the foreign presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, ambassadors, and everyone else who will soon be calling to ask for exemptions from these tariffs, I say, terminate your own tariffs, drop your barriers.
Conventional wisdom says there are no winners in a trade war. It is understood in Europe that businesses and consumers on both sides of the Atlantic stand to lose if Brussels retaliates in a way that raises the risk of a trade war of tit-for-tat tariffs. Calls for zero tariffs, a free trade zone between the EU and the US, are growing louder from business. But it will have to be the will of the politicians before it can become reality.
Catherine Kluver-Ashbrook joins us from the Bertelsmann Foundation, an independent think tank. Trump's been going to the extreme with his tariffs. Elon Musk suddenly wants none. Many European leaders have been pushing for exactly that for years. What's going on here?
Well, Ben, I think you made your point very well, which is that we're in a situation that's about as clear as mud, because the ambitions of the US administration are really hard to discern for Europeans right now. Do they really want something that is akin to a free trade zone across the globe? That is something that many could get behind, as we just heard in your piece. Or are they really trying to, as the president also says, bring in a lot of money to fill the coffers such that you no longer need US income tax? Also a problematic situation that wouldn't work out in that same way. So right now, the signaling from the White House is by far the most confusing for other trade partners. So I assume that what we'll hear from the finance minister's meeting today in Luxembourg, as we just heard, is a strong signal that they're willing to go toe-to-toe, at least in a first round, with the White House, negotiations still pending.
And what would you say Elon Musk's role is in all of this?
Well, I think Elon Musk's role is reducing in the White House, because now the president has surrounded himself by, in some respects, one might say the trade sycophants in his administration. Howard Lutnick, he's listening to much more. That probably explains the odd type of calculation matrix that we saw displayed in the White House last week. We've now also learned more about the math that the president did there. He looked only at the absolute cost in goods and not what the supply chain, the sort of the retail price, Axios revealed over the weekend. So there's a lot of issues with the math there, but Elon Musk needs to make sure that his businesses survive. And that sort of predicates likely somewhat of an exit from his close role in the White House to focus on his business interests, because the situation with China, where Elon Musk makes 950,000 cars a year, is not easy now that China has put on full-blown retaliatory tariffs. So Elon Musk will try to whisper, but will he get through with another ring of advisors so closely around the president? That's the question.
Very good question. So extreme swings in policy, extreme falls on markets. Can we expect a bounce back, as Trump's hinting, or are we in for a serious recession here?
Well, I said as early as the inauguration that we would see recessive energies by the end of Q1, and that's exactly where we are. I think you are going to have problems for, even if tomorrow negotiations started and things began to shift, businesses are cautious, businesses are anxious, as are investors. We're seeing this morning with the Asian markets. They are going to tread very lightly in switching their money around, in looking at their supply chains. What investors need more than anything is predictability. And even if negotiations, again, started within the next 24 hours, which they won't, that predictability won't return. So I expect more volatility, inflationary pressure, like we heard from Jerome Powell last week, and we're hearing from the Europeans. This is going to be an extraordinarily tough situation for the global financial and trading markets. And the only person at this point who can ease that pain would be Donald Trump. That's the way he likes it. The imperialist in the White House, with everybody else coming to kiss the ring and seek tribute. That's really not a way to make sustainable trade negotiations.
Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook, you said it. Thanks very much for being on our show.
My pleasure.
Our correspondent Lucia Schulten is at the trade ministers' meeting in Luxembourg, which I mentioned before. Lucia, what's the mood there like? One of retaliation or negotiation?
So the European Commission has been really making clear that they first want to negotiate. So that is the big hope here in the European Union still, that there is a solution which can be negotiated. Nevertheless, they have also been making very clear, especially Ursula von der Leyen last week has been saying that the European Union is ready to give a strong response and that they're already preparing countermeasures. They're already working on tariffs against the steel and aluminium, which have been announced later, and they're also working on more countermeasures when it comes to the so-called reciprocal tariffs. So it is a twofold strategy. On the one hand, they still want to negotiate. On the other hand, they're preparing. And this is what the current mood here is right now. They want to be ready to give a firm response, but they're still clinging on this hope that they could negotiate with the United States.
But surely this sudden American idea of zero tariffs, which many Europeans have wanted for a long time, do resonate with leaders there?
So I think what is important to see is that this is really not a completely new idea. over 10 years ago, negotiations started on a so-called TTIP agreement. The TTIP agreement would have created a massive trade and investment partnership between the United States and the European Union. These negotiations back then failed, and right now there might be a new opportunity to give this a push, and we will make sure to ask these questions to the trade ministers, which are really important in these questions, the trade ministers of the 27 EU member states, which will arrive here in Luxembourg. We will make sure to ask them the question what they will think of this, so stay tuned.
Yeah, TTIP being that transatlantic trade and investment partnership, which we talked so much about for so long. There were other deals like that around the Pacific where Asian nations were keen on zero tariffs, the US wasn't. Are the ministers there where you are just talking tariffs all day?
Well, they will also talk about the trade relations with another extremely important trade partner of the European Union, which is China. So the Trade Commissioner here, Maroš Šefčovič, he has just been to China recently, and he will come back here and brief his colleagues, the trade ministers, of the current state and also of his visit. And then in the end, what is to be expected here from this meeting, and I think this is also important to know, is that there will be given political guidance, especially when it comes to the United States, but there will be no concrete legislative decisions taken here by the ministers. It's more about discussions, and it's more about getting out also a united message. This is what we've heard from a senior EU diplomat beforehand.
A united message and hopefully some sort of deal. Lucia Schulten for us in Luxembourg. Great catching up.